Welcome everybody. I hope you can hear me and see me. I'm just gonna, yeah, I can see that that's working. So I'm gonna just put the screen again. My name is Francesco Cindico. I am the director of the Strathclyde Center for Environmental Law and Governance here at the University of Strathclyde Law School. And while I introduce our speaker, I would like to encourage all of you in the room with us to introduce yourself as well, and just to get a sense of who's in the room and who's participating to this webinar. When Professor Cinema and Carlarne will give her presentation, we will disable the chat so we can all enjoy her presentation and we can all actually focus on her presentation. And once she finishes her presentation, I will open the chat again, and obviously I will be happy throughout to take questions, which I will then share with Professor Cinema and Carlarne. This is a SCELG seminar. We have a lot of these during the years, but this is one I'm particularly excited. It gives us the opportunity to have with us a fantastic colleague, a fantastic scholar. And I'll just say a few words about her. Cinema and Carlarne is the Associate Dean for Faculty and Intellectual Life at the Alumni Society, designated Professor of Law at the Moritz College of Law at the Ohio State University in the US. She has worked on many areas, but some of them that we all know are obviously international climate change law, comparative climate change law, and she has books with Oxford University Press, with Foundation Press, and with other very important publishers. One of the main ones, I would say, the ones that I use a lot as well, is the Oxford Handbook of International Climate Change Law. And very excitingly, she is in a new project, in a new book, which is about the future of climate law, and it's called Climate Courage. And if you see the title of today's presentation, Climate Courage, Reimagining the Promise and Possibilities of Climate Law, I'm quite sure that we will hear more about that book project. So I'm going to stop sharing here. And before I give you the floor, Cinnamon, just a very warm thanks again for joining us today. And I will give you the floor for around 30 minutes. And I'm looking forward to a lively chat, a lively discussion with people at the webinar with us. And obviously, it goes without saying that we all know that Glasgow, all going well, will be hosting COP26. So there will be plenty of things to discuss after your talk. So I give you the floor, Cinnamon, and thanks again for joining us here at SCELG.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Cindico. It's lovely to be here. It's a real pleasure and honor to join this series and have the chance to chat with everybody. And I love just kind of seeing who's here and seeing the chats that and introductions. So I just want to say thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to the Center for Environmental Law and Governance for sponsoring this series and really kind of just encouraging this kind of engagement and conversation, particularly during these times when we're all so separate, but yet needing to think together and listen together, even more so than ever. Okay, so today I want to use my time wisely so that we have plenty of time for chat and Q&A afterwards. And so I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about this project that I'm really just beginning to work on and think through in distinct kind of ways. And so this is the Climate Courage Project. So we all know, really, of course, everyone here, of course, knows that climate change is profoundly reshaping our world in very deeply differentiated ways. And of course, COVID-19 is really showing us this more than ever. Now, within this kind of maelstrom of change, efforts to respond to climate change have the potential to simultaneously limit the negative effects of climate change and also fundamentally reshape existing social, political, and economic relationships in line with parallel social movements that are focused on gender, racial, and income inequality, among others. Climate change really therefore poses both an existential challenge and an unprecedented opportunity to envision and move towards a really different kind of world, a world where the rule of law reflects deeper notions of equality among and between humans and the natural world. This vision for society and for the role of the rule of law in society is being advanced in varying forms around the world. Despite these burgeoning efforts, the pathways we'll take and the role of the rule of law in addressing climate change, as we all know, remains indeterminate. Even as the urgency of the challenge crystallizes, legal and political strategies remain piecemeal and fragmented. In the political hallways where the rule of law is fashioned and refashioned, the debates remain, by and large, staid and conventional. Conversations focus on questions of incremental carbon taxes and cap and trade regimes, of bridge fuels, nuclear lifespans, and technological fixes. Outside the hallways of power, however, very different conversations are taking place. Different voices are being raised, different visions of the rule of law are being advanced. At their core, these visions seek to harness the rule of law as a tool not for sustaining the norm, but instead for engaging inevitable disruption as an opportunity to reimagine and reconfigure the world. This project that I'm thinking about and talking about today, which is still in this emergent phase, seeks to center and engage these visions more directly. While the focus of this project is global, and necessarily so, in this first stage, I'm going to focus on the United States as a vehicle for thinking about these issues. And so that's largely what I'll be talking about today. Now, in the time we have together, I want to try to do three things. First, I want to spotlight the absence of deep, sustained political leadership on climate change and explore the implications of this leadership gap. I really hope and believe this is changing in the United States, but the long-standing leadership gap, the political leadership gap, is acute and has been profoundly debilitating to efforts to address climate change. Second, I want to highlight the role of social movements in shaping climate law and policy. And here I'll discuss how intersecting social, political, economic, and ecological crises are spawning social movements that are really feeding social movements that are unleashing more inclusive visions of life under and beyond the rule of law. These hopeful visions for the future are fueling revolutions. Climate revolutions, racial and social justice revolutions, income inequality revolutions that are as powerful as they are for now peaceful. Third, I will offer a glimpse into how different voices are helping shape the rule of law on climate change within this space. So let's dive in by thinking about leadership as our first kind of entry point. Now, in his 1965 Pulitzer Prize winning book, Profiles in Courage, then Senator JFK, John F. Kennedy, celebrated the lives of 8 senators whose lives and decisions he believed represented models of political courage. Seeking to understand how political leaders either falter or forge ahead in quiet and calamitous moments of crisis, Kennedy examined the pressures that statesmen, we'll come back to that, face and the various ways in which they respond to these pressures. He sought to shine a light on those statements, on those statesmen who had demonstrated grace under pressure. At the time, and for Kennedy, political leaders were men who defied their parties and their electorates more often than not on matters of slavery and the integrity of the rule of law. Each of the 8 that he focused on made difficult decisions at a high cost to their political careers to advance what they thought was right. They were brave, they were bold, they were courageous. They represented models of courage that helped keep our system of democratic governance upright and functioning, and they ensured the integrity of the rule of law at the core of the democratic system. To Kennedy at the time, those statesmen were indelible icons of democracy. Today, that bravery and boldness and courage largely, I believe, has been outsourced. Our icons of democracy are more dispersed and more varied. With few exceptions, the statesmen in the halls of power around the world lead tepidly, if at all, on matters of great importance, including climate change. Nowhere is this truer than in the United States, where, with few exceptions, high-level leadership has been woefully lacking. Even in moments where our leaders have sought to be bold, they have largely failed to harness the legacies of power and the wells of potential influence that are available to them to advance and undergird our democracy for present and future generations. Think here even about the efforts of President Obama, Vice President Gore, Senator Kerry, and Senator Markey, all of whom have sought to exert some degree of leadership, but in virtually every case, the leadership has proved modest and ultimately largely ineffective. Moreover, for every morsel of courage these leaders show, they are confronted tenfold with not just political resistance, but outright rejection of science and fundamental challenges to the reality of climate change by their fellow statesmen and statespeople. The thinness of leadership confronted by the outsized and unabashed degree of science denial, cooperation mockery, and economic collusion between the powerful fossil fuel industry and a largely obliging set of statespeople mean that there's not just been an abdication of leadership, but outright hostility and brazen opposition to virtually any action on climate change. To put this in a broader, starker context, with very limited exception, the US Congress, our statespeople, have failed to either adopt or amend any federal environmental legislation for more than 30 years, more than most of my students have been alive. Our rule of law in the environment is stale and only still evolving due to the work of administrative agencies, the courts, and very critically, civil society. Where our statespeople were once leaders, where they were bold and shaping the rule of law, they are now at best laggards. However, hopefully, as Kennedy suggested, in the end, we the people are the boss, and we will get the kind of political leadership, be it good or bad, that we demand or deserve. So hopefully we're moving in the right direction. This has proven true in critical historical moments in the US democracy. In those moments, statesmen ushered in, finally, the abolition of slavery, the vote for women, the right for laborers, the Civil Rights Act, the Disability Rights Act, and the Clean Air Act. Of course, while the statesmen and statespeople ultimately passed those bills, even then, the true warriors for change were the abolitionists, the suffragettes, the environmental, civil rights, labor, and disability rights activists who labored long and hard, often risking their families, their jobs, and even, of course, their lives, to elevate these issues to the level of political and legal recognition. The work of allowing legislators to envision and depict these issues within the scope of the rule of law began outside the hallways of Congress. But as President Kennedy understood, the ultimate power to leverage the rule of law to effect change required then, in the end, courageous statesmen and statespeople who could respond to pressures with political and moral courage to vote right when given the opportunity to do so. It was this courage, and again, this grace under pressure, that President Kennedy lauded as the hallmark of our democracy, a democracy that in the end, he believed would reward courage, respect honor, and ultimately recognize right. That vision of democracy has always been tenuously held and hard fought for. Now more than ever, that thick vision of democracy and that hopeful vision of courageous state people, which were then statesmen and now, thank goodness, are statespeople, but that vision of them as beacons of right and arbiters of courage and influence is under pressure. Faith in the ability of our democratic system to leverage the rule of law to address the greatest challenges of our time has really eroded almost to the point of collapse. It's not irrevocably destroyed, but the kind of radical change needed to reinvigorate our democracy and address the inequalities and environmental degradation that threatens to undermine the health and well-being of the system and its citizens cannot be found within or solely attributed to a small handful of statespeople. In this moment, even as we continue to look inward and look upward to our statespeople to lead with courage and with conviction, we must expand our vision and embrace of leadership and courage outward more deliberately so that we can see those who are creating the space, the momentum, the energy, ideas that hopefully will allow our statespeople to step up, heed those visions, and lead. Nowhere is this more critical, of course, than in the context of climate change, particularly though, as it intersects with ongoing efforts to address social, racial, and economic inequality. And increasingly, this is how we do and must conceptualize climate change, as an intersectional challenge that ripples along and threatens to exacerbate existing pathways of inequality, but also as a challenge that poses opportunities to radically disrupt the subjugating power of existing systems as we pursue these pathways for just transition. We're now really in a moment where we are witnessing a widespread reckoning of both the power and the possibilities of climate change. This reckoning is propelled by a diverse group of actors increasingly coalescing around notions of intersectional climate justice. These actors are mobilizing social movements that offer alternative ways of viewing the world and alternative ways of viewing the power and possibilities of the rule of law. So let's briefly turn to our kind of second theme, which is the kind of the role of social movements in this regard. So despite deepening appreciation for the scale of climate change, again, we still lack the governance structures necessary to address the crisis. The inadequacy of existing structures of law in particular is thrown into relief and compounded by ongoing debates centered around who we are and how we should relate to one another, both as national and international citizens. On one hand, even as climate law has emerged and evolved based on notions of inter and intra-generational equity and fundamental human rights, these norms are being challenged and undermined by swelling populist, right-wing populist, nationalist, and authoritarian movements worldwide. The swell of populism and nationalism challenge the degree to which there is, or possibly even ever was, consensus and support for the post-war liberal values upon which much of our contemporary systems of law, including international climate change law, are built, even if very fragilely so. So concerns about a crisis of world order in this regard really do abound, and pressures mounting to examine the stability of the institutions and the normative foundations of the international system amidst the resurgence of right-wing populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism. The resulting erosion of the respect for this kind of rights-enabling vision of the international rule of law threatens to undermine efforts to advance international cooperation on many issues, including climate change. However, against that backdrop of decline, there's this really important surge of energy and efforts pushing back against the erosion of democracy, cooperative will, and a rights-infused vision of the rule of law. There are counter trends that are particularly visible at the national level to expand the rule of law with respect to the rights of nature and the relationship between human rights and the environment, as well as to advance a more climate and equality-oriented vision of populism. These trends push back and up against these kind of downward pressures on the rule of law and create the foundations for a transformative vision of law premised on the notion that addressing climate change means addressing the roots of the system that gave rise to it, which in turn requires understanding the intimate linkages between environmental degradation and social, racial, and economic injustice at multiple levels. As my wonderful colleague Amna Akbar has recently said, we're living in a time of grassroots demands to transform our built environment and our relationship with one another and the earth. We are living, that is, in a potentially transformative moment where finally we are beginning to see climate change and climate law not as a problem of and for the field of environmental law, but as tied up to much larger systemic structures. In this moment, we are seeing a return to the power of the social movements that we discovered in the 1960s that really gave rise to the environmental, civil rights, labor, disability, and women's rights movements and more during that time. Of course, many of those movements do have older and deeper roots, but in the 1960s and 70s, this kind of represented a period in time where social movements gained power and momentum, resulting in the leveraging of law and policy to push social and legal change forward. Each of these movements at the time made significant progress towards advancing their respective goals, but across the board, we still find ourselves pushing for the kind of deep structural change and law reform that these movements envisioned now more than kind of half a century ago. What we are witnessing now is a revitalization and a deepening of these movements. Only unlike the 1960s and 70s, now instead of kind of growing separately and going down their individual pathways, the branches of these movements are increasingly intertwining, recognizing that their roots are in fact really complexly entangled. So for context, let's briefly think about this with respect to the evolution of environmental and women's rights movements of the 60s and 70s. So contemporary environmentalism and feminism, kind of the women's rights movement, developed side by side in the 60s and 70s, prompting pretty rapid growth in legal architecture in both areas. Buoyed by the mainstream voices at the time, environmentalism and environmental law thrived during these early years, but it did so increasingly over time, largely in isolation from this kind of tangled web of social justice challenges ushered in by parallel social movements and law reform projects, including second wave women's liberation movement in that era. So as the field of US environmental law grew with the 70s, 80s, et cetera, the erection of a very complex body of law, it evolved to focus on discrete causal pathways between human health and environmental degradation and between economic and environmental interests. It emerged in a very fragmented manner, with each new law creating a fairly insular, medium-focused regime. The laws that were developed during the heyday of domestic environmental law in the US in the 1970s were characterized by their ambition and their efforts to engage with science to prompt technological innovation and to promote both human health and economic well-being. They were also, however, characterized by their narrow focus on particular environmental challenges and technological solutions to these challenges. Moreover, the optimism and visions of harmony that shaped environmental law's kind of auspicious birth in the US quickly faded amidst the really kind of social and political realities of the very hyper-capitalistic 1980s and 90s. At the time, then, environmental law became a terrain of kind of scrappy, backroom bureaucratic fighting, where every effort to reduce air and water pollution, to protect individual species, to clean up abandoned waste sites, involved years of effort, litigation, and multiple concessions. Little thought, much less little attention, was given to racial, gender, or social justice implications of environmental degradation, or to the potentially subordinating impacts of environmental law itself. Piece by piece, kind of early formative visions of the intimate links between ecological health and human health and well-being were chopped up and kind of drowned out as environmental law staked out its territory law by law, issue by issue, walling itself off to its ecological roots, to the lessons of ecofeminism, and above all, to the complex relationship between humans and nature. As a result, the environmental and women's rights movements of the 1960s and 70s matured side by side, but definitely not arm in arm. The same was true for the environmental movement and the civil rights movement, the labor rights movement, etc. So for at least the first 2 decades of modern environmental law, gender, race, and inequality considerations were largely absent from the narrative and practice of mainstream environmental law. Gradually, however, the threads of environmental, feminist, social, racial, and economic justice legal theory are entwining, prompted in no small part, of course, by the climate crisis and the maturing environmental justice and climate justice movements. Faced with the greatest existential challenge of our time, environmental law is coming full circle to remember the ecological lesson that in the end and at the beginning, everything is interconnected. At least for anthropocentrically minded environmentalists, this comes with recognition that responding to the climate crisis requires responding to deep systemic inequities. And for those concerned with gender, racial, and economic justice, likewise, this means recognizing that responding to deep systemic inequalities will and does require responding to the climate crisis. So as a result, climate change creates this kind of inevitable urgency, but also the opportunity to rethink the role of limiting the negative effects of climate change and reconfiguring social, political, and economic relationships along the way. So the climate crisis has revived dialogue at the intersection of feminism, environmentalism, and social justice, and created kind of space and momentum for intersectional ideas to flourish. As Professor Carmen Gonzalez recently reminded us in the panel I hosted, crisis begets opportunity. So for lawyers and global citizens, the opportunity is to see climate change within its broader social context and to seize upon the rule of law as a powerful tool for positive change, taking our lead not from the statesmen of old who offer at best incremental change, but instead from the women, the youth, the indigenous people, the people of color, the believers and the innovators, the states people of new, who do not have the privilege of power or history on their side, but whose voices, ideas, and energy have built and maintained momentum on climate change when the powerful have largely failed to do so, and whose vision for the future is one of inclusivity. And of course, who seek to leverage the rule of law in the end and kind of to wrestle it away from being the darling of the ruling elite to ensure it's used to advance a broader and more inclusive set of interests. This vision and this courage and these protagonists of change enable now President Biden to speak from the platform he occupies. It's provided him and his team the space and the vocabulary to advance intersectional justice-based responses to climate change. His privilege in this fight is in no small part due to the persistent voices of many people outside the hallways of power. So who are these protagonists of change who are helping lay this critical foundation and whose vision of the rule of law now helps guide us? In my remaining few minutes, I'll just try to sketch out some of these voices and movements that the project will ultimately spotlight in greater detail. So recognizing fully that the categories are non-exclusive and overlapping, the groups whose work is shaping a new and more transformative vision of the rule of law include women, youth, people of color, progressive political leaders, sub-federal leaders, etc. And in the project, I'm going to explore those similarities and their differences and how they conceptualize the challenge of climate change and how they imagine the rule of law as a tool for restructuring our economy in order to transition to a clean energy future. But a narrative thread that binds many of these efforts together, of course, is an emphasis on climate justice, which, as Professor Maxime Burkett tells us, allows us to see and respond to the direct kinship between social inequality and environmental degradation. Climate justice draws from the US environmental justice movement and seeks to really focus on the social and economic inequality challenges that led to and perpetuate climate change. So led by climate justice considerations, there is a growing movement fighting to amplify the voices and increase the involvement in decision-making by those people who are most affected by climate change. So just kind of for a moment, keeping with our theme of thinking about the environmental gender intersection, this includes in particular women and girls who are and always have been at the forefront of the climate justice movement. Across generations and across the globe, female leaders are springing up. In addition to prominent political leaders such as Christiana Figueres and Mary Robinson, I think I saw Christina Voigt here today, and she's definitely in that list. On this list is Greta Thunberg, the teenage founder, of course, of Fridays for Future, India Logan Riley, a young Maori activist doing climate work, Isra Hirsi, who is a teenage co-founder of the climate justice movement in the US, Leah Thomas, who is really focusing on intersectional environmentalism, Oladusu Adenike, who is a Nigerian ecofeminist. They are profoundly shaping conversations around climate change in different and important ways. And they really, this kind of climate justice movement that they represent envisions a world where we're simultaneously limiting the negative effects of climate change while also transforming social, political, and economic relationships. And really importantly, this is a way of thinking that has roots. It builds on the work of really pivotal early environmental leaders such as Wangari Maathai, who've long advocated for tackling the root causes of inequality as not just complementary, but essential to efforts to combat environmental degradation. And so bringing this kind of multivocal, justice-oriented approach to climate change draws upon long-standing ideas, both kind of in the environmental sphere, but also in feminist legal theory and critical race theory that seek to situate gender and race within multiple overlapping structures of power, authority, and inequality to better understand and respond to the root causes and consequences of systemic inequalities. So let me just end by talking about one discrete area where we can see this, and this is kind of with Green New Deal movement. So globally, Green New Deal proposals exemplify this approach quite well. Such an approach was proposed in the US in 2019. It was prompted really in large part by the youth climate movement and then advanced by one of our kind of climate leaders, US Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, alongside longtime climate advocate Senator Ed Markey, who I mentioned earlier. The Green New Deal frames climate change as a crisis that exacerbates systemic injustice and intersects with the related crises of racial and economic inequality, declining life expectancy, wage stagnation, deindustrialization, and anti-labor policies. It proposes a sweeping new national, social, industrial, and economic response along the lines of the New Deal that would advance and invest enormous resources and programs to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions, but in a fair and just way. A core component of the Green New Deal is emphasizing opportunities for communities of color, and also just trying to do a lot to kind of think about the roots of the problem itself. Now, even though the Green New Deal struggled, as many of you know, to gain congressional support, it reflected both the growing chorus of diverse voices fighting for a reframing of climate change, and it created a powerful framework that the current administration is actually now drawing heavily upon in its efforts to frame and address climate change. In other words, those many voices in their individual and collective capacities fought long enough and hard enough to be heard, to be echoed in the hallways of power, and to create opportunities for leveraging law from the local to the national level, not just for conventional change that embeds pre-existing structures, but instead seeks to chip away at those structures and offer new visions for the world that law can actually help us achieve. So fundamentally, these many courageous climate leaders are teaching us that a kind of feminist imbued, social and racial justice oriented approach to climate change is essential to counteracting law's subordinating tendencies and deepening law's ability to respond to the intrinsic relationships between environmental degradation and inequality. This would not and will not be possible without the persistence of these many courageous voices. So to conclude, as Mary Robinson, one of these great leaders, says, having squandered past opportunities and shirked previous commitments, we now must start making up for lost time. Making up for lost time means abandoning the idea that courage and leadership on climate change has or will come from the top down and from traditional sources of power, or that climate law must or even can stay in traditional legal lanes. Instead, making up for lost time means more intentionally looking to and more carefully listening to and elevating voices outside the hallways of power. The voices of those whose lives and future depend on disrupting persistent patterns of inequality and degradation, so that our efforts today ensure that the world that we sustain, and really more importantly, the world that we build, is livable as a livable world for us all. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely super interesting and fascinating. I've already seen a few questions, and I will give a little bit of time to our participants to maybe put a few more in the Q&A box. Before I do that, I realized the chat was open only to panelists at the beginning. So I have copy-pasted what people have put in, and I am putting it again. It's a bit messy, but that way you can see what other people in the group have put it by introducing themselves. So while we do the Q&A, while we have the conversation with Cinnamon, if you do want to put a few words in the chat, or if you have any resources, or if you have any links to events that relate to what Cinnamon was talking about, or her topics, I will be sharing the chat with Cinnamon afterwards. So it will be a great way to be in touch with her. But I will start with the first question, if you don't mind, Cinnamon. This comes from Kate McKenzie, who works with us at the center as a PhD researcher. And I think she has a very good point there. She's talking, and you can see the question yourself, both you, Cinnamon, and everybody, all the participants. I will not read it out loud, but I think the way I interpret that is that in most countries you have a 4, sometimes 8-year cycle. And when political positions are very different, let's say, that can really shift climate policy. Obviously, we're all, still somewhat digesting the big change in the US, but I can think of so many other countries where you have similar issues. You have similar issues from from governments that are more eco-friendly to others that are more business as usual, if you want to call it like that, others that are very close to carbon unfriendly policies. So what needs to be included to ensure continued success, even if there is a change in power? That's really at the heart of Kate's question. So I leave that to you, and then I'll get a few more questions.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that I've thought a lot about. A lot of my work has been kind of outwardly focused and comparative over the years, but increasingly I've been thinking about the US, because the US is such a powerful player, of course, but also because our politics and our kind of the future of our democracy is so tumultuous. And so I want to talk about it a little bit in the context of the US, and then think about the international sphere. So interestingly, in the United States, we've had these like massive shifts from Obama to Trump to Biden now. And what's been really, really fascinating is how even as devastating as the Trump presidency was in many ways, over time, enabled through the Obama administration, we've seen the growth of these kind of sub layers of power. And by that, I mean, you know, state actors, everything from California to more cities that are doing more to address climate change, to these more volunteer efforts. You know, in the US, there's a thing called We're Still In during the Trump administration that had states and cities and religious leaders and universities that basically pledged to still meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And then you couple that with both this growing social movement and the kind of intersectional social movement, and then also the role of climate litigation. And what you see that gives me hope is that even with these high-level political fluctuations, which are so frustrating, and ultimately we do need the state because the state can hinder or help, but what you do see is this kind of growth of momentum that limits the ability of the state to kind of devastate progress. And I think that that's been really important in the United States, because even under the Trump administration, we saw states move forward, we saw climate litigation create extra pressure, we saw social movements leading to pretty profound shifts in how a wider swath of society think about and respond to climate change and other issues. And so, yes, I think that those shifts are devastating, but I do think that what we're starting to see is shifts in the kind of the base of power that actually provide really powerful counterpoints to the state. And so, I mean, I would suggest that that's a positive force, but of course, what we need to do, if you think about this at the US level, you know, one of the reasons why the president is so powerful is because we don't have any kind of legislation. You know, the presidents have less ability to change legislation than they do, you know, EPA administrative rules. And because of what I mentioned during my talk, which is we haven't updated our environmental law in 30 years, that gives the president more power, which then allows these greater fluctuations. So the degree to which we can really mobilize for more presidential resistant policies, the better off we'll be. But I also do think that this kind of widespread social change we're seeing is incredibly important, because it's just changing the base from which we think about and respond to climate change. And there was a second piece of that at the international level, but I can't see the question anymore. I wanted to, yeah, I mean, I don't think we can ever guard against completely the change in power. But I think what we can do is we like empower and mobilize more voices and more visions of leadership beyond the presidency, the less impact those dramatic changes will have.
I disappeared for a while, but I'm happy you continue talking. I cannot see your screen. I hope other people can. Oh, there you are. Perfect. So in terms of cities and in terms of other actors, I think one of the points I would like to raise, and then I'll move on to the following questions, is that this has been obviously a phenomenon that obviously goes beyond just the US. And interestingly, also the international climate change legal regime to some extent has captured that. And since the previous COP to Paris, the one in Lima, with the Nazca platform, and really the encouragement of lodging good practices from subnational actors, even from private sector to some extent, really shows how multifaceted the climate change efforts are, and also climate leadership is. So it's not really just the federal government in the case of the US, it really comes from all sectors of society and the other political areas. And I think some of the questions touch upon that. And I will get to our colleague from the University of Eastern Finland in just a second, but I will jump to Chris and to Fiona, because I do think both questions are a nice follow-up to this. So Chris asks about another constituency, if you want, which are the judges. And she is asking you whether you can just say about courage by judges. And also the actual Green parties. And he says that the offering a skewed leadership. Is your idea of courageous leadership not a little out of sync with the non-hierarchy often stressed by Greens? So I'll let you answer that, comment on that, the judges and the Green parties of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are both great questions. And so in one of my other projects, I've just been doing a lot of work on climate litigation, and thinking about the incredibly important role that climate litigation is playing in a variety of ways, both in terms of the variety of litigation, and also of course the rights turn in litigation, and which actually goes to the first question of thinking about ways to kind of counter the powerful impact of those political fluctuations. And so, of course, a lot of that litigation is focused on thinking about, embedding climate-related obligations in both our system of human rights and in the U.S. and other places in our systems of constitutional rights. Because to the extent that there's a human right to a safe and healthy climate, or a constitutional right at a domestic level to a climate that sustains present and future generations, that, of course, has a powerful counterbalancing effect on any kind of executive power. And I do think that this is, it's a complicated field, of course, because, the judges do not, and our courts are not as representative of our democratic system and the plethora of voices that exist. But I do think that they have a powerful and important role to play. And I think in those instances where our political branches have really failed to act in ways that fundamentally undermine fundamental human and constitutional rights, it's not that the judges are being activists, but that they actually have a role and obligation to play in respecting and finding those new rights and corresponding obligations in the same way that we saw with kind of Obergefell and LGBT rights in the United States. And I think that that's one of the things that we've seen in the US with the Juliana litigation that's ongoing, the Children's Trust litigation, where the district court judge and the Ninth Circuit dissenting judge were both really, really emphasizing the important role that judges have to play in this regard. And so I certainly, that's certainly a category of folks that I intend to think about more carefully. But I do agree with you that they have a really important role to play. And then the second question I think is a really interesting one. What about Green parties that eschew leadership? Is your idea of courageous leadership not a little out of sync with the non-hierarchy often stressed by Greens? So the first thing is my idea of leadership is not, I think, maybe I framed it within a hierarchy to say that, what I really want is to make sure we're empowering these voices so that they can help influence change, but that ultimately we still have this top layer and we need to figure out ways for the voices to be heard and responded to at that top layer. But I think my vision of leadership is kind of multifaceted. And so I'm not sure exactly how to answer this question, except just to say that, it's not just the Green groups that have skewed leadership in this way. It's also, many organizations that are focused on gender-related issues that are also deeply suspicious of hierarchical structures, and even kind of, downward-facing human rights kind of systems. And so I think part of what we need to be doing is just listening to those voices more and finding greater ways for those voices to be heard kind of outside of their narrow circles. So I don't have a great answer to that, except just to say that I personally think that hierarchy is problematic, but of course it persists. And so part of what we need to be doing is finding ways for non-powerful, non-entrenched voices to be heard in such a way that we can begin to kind of chip away at those hierarchies that do kind of embed existing structures of inequality. And thanks, Chris, for the question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much,
Hi,
Chris. I'll get to Fiona's and Carla together, but I am quite interested in, because obviously Green parties exist as political parties with some representation in countries where there are a lot of parties. And this is something that from a European perspective has always, well, baffled me, maybe is not the right word because it has an almost negative connotation, but just, it's just a different thing. As far as I'm aware, in the US, you only have two political parties. There's only two that, really count to some extent. So from a US perspective, and you don't need to answer now because there are so many other people that want to get into the conversation, but I do wonder from a US perspective, when you hear Green Party, what does that even resonate or mean and so forth? Again, we don't need to get into that, but it is something that does strike me as complicated, let's say.
Yeah, actually, when I was reading that quickly, I was thinking about Green groups. You're right.
And
sorry, can you hear me okay? Am I frozen or? Can folks hear?
No, Francesco's got an
So,
issue with his broadband.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
I can hear you, Cinnamon.
Okay, I'll keep going. So actually, one of the things I wanted to say,
Yes.
I was thinking about green groups as opposed to green parties, just because, yeah, there my US focus came in. But one of the things I really have been thinking a lot about, that maybe I'll just throw out here too, is just a really important role that green parties and maybe green organizations need to play in this shift. Because one of the things that we've seen in the US, and I think elsewhere, but I think that there's variety, is that much of our mainstream environmental law, but also our environmental organizations and our really powerful environmental organizations in the United States have been fairly homogenous and fairly kind of, not very diverse in their constituency and their representation. And so I think green groups are actually starting to kind of have this internal conversation about the fact that they need to think about, the limited voice that they've had and the limited representation they've had in the past. And this is our big groups from Environmental Defense Fund outward, right? They're fantastic, but they are having this internal reckoning in this conversation about, who they are and who they represent, who they have represented in the past. And I think that that's really, really important, because to the extent that they can be more inclusive in their vision of who they represent and what they're kind of fighting for, I think that that is an important part of having kind of a much more inclusive conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear. I think ask Cinnamon to take the questions yourself. I'm really sorry. I shouldn't do that as a host, but if it does happen, I may just ask you to do that. But I'm still here, and hopefully you can hear me. So Fiona and Carla have obviously different but somewhat linked questions. And the way I understand them, and obviously you can read them as well, is that Fiona is really asking, which channels or fora can offer new possibilities for hearing and involving the provocative voices needed to encourage such changes in the rule of law. And Carla, again, the way I understand it from E3G, is asking, yeah, but how does that happen in countries where it is a bit more complicated, let's say? So she says, how do you see the question of social movements and the narrative of democratic or civil space? How will these movements be expressed or be possible in obstructed countries? Are there limits to the lifting social movements can do on climate? So I let you take it as you wish, these two questions, and then I will move to our colleague from the University of Eastern Finland.
Yeah, these are both great questions. I'm going to kind of try to look at them as I go along. So what channels or fora do you see as fundamental as offering new possibilities for hearing involving the provocative voices needed to encourage such changes in the rule of law? So I don't have, I wish I had more magic answers. I think that at the international level, for example, in the Warsaw Mechanism and the development of the Warsaw Mechanism, there's particular ways in which that can be used as a tool for elevating these voices within the, the international climate change negotiations, for example. I'm sorry, I realize my dog is behind me being distracting. I might move her in a moment. But, in the context of
no worries.
Zoom life. But also kind of tying this to the second question from Carla, which is also great about, the way in which, having, the United States social movements are empowered in particular ways that they may not be elsewhere. But actually what we're starting to see is the really, really important role of social media. And so some of the most powerful voices in the kind of the intersectional space and the women's rights space are actually, have been given voice through social media. And so thinking about the young activists I mentioned from Nigeria, and of course Greta Thunberg and others. And so I do think that, even as we think about, channels of power and the rule of law, that really engaging with the power of social movement in those conversations is really, really important. And I do think that actually also as we think, and Christina could probably speak to this much, much more precisely, but as we start to think about the evolution of the Paris Agreement and the NDCs, that I think there's a way for the international climate change regime to kind of move away from a pretty liberal constrained idea of like, we have amazing women in power in the international climate change regime, amazing, so much better than in other spaces. But as we start to think about, notions of equity and what we're looking for in the NDCs, and how we're thinking about adaptation funding and the operations of the Green Climate Fund, that there are ways in which we can think about issues of kind of gender and inclusivity much more specifically. And I think that those are hard conversations, but I definitely think that those are, you know, really important avenues. And so I guess what I guess the way I'm thinking about this is trying to embrace, you know, the way in which these voices are emerging from social movements and from social media, and then finding ways to kind of funnel their voices and their messages in different ways. And that's through everything from the Green New Deal, through the development of the Warsaw mechanism, through more participatory mechanisms. I think we're seeing it through climate litigation. And I think, you know, the more we can do to just kind of directly embrace the importance of this kind of diversity of voices, the better off we are. And I will just say, just really briefly, that, you know, it's been fascinating to watch the Biden administration as they start to structure their responses to climate change and environmental issues, because we are seeing the use of the terminology of climate justice and environmental justice and intersectional climate change, which honestly we just really had never seen before, even under the Obama administration. And again, that would have not been possible without just the persistence of these voices across time. So Gina McCarthy, you know, the President Biden's climate envoy, came into that first press conference and referred to climate change as an intersectional challenge. You could not have imagined that 4 years ago. And so, you know, some of it is discrete pathways, others is just the persistence of these voices and finding more ways to elevate them through legal scholarship, through these conversations, plus, plus, plus.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Cinnamon. So I will now go back to Reimagining from the University of Eastern Finland. It's the first question that we have in the Q&A.
About the international climate change regime?
And it's a bit more focused on what in Europe done by the international climate regime in integrating gender issues into climate adaptation laws. If you have an answer to that, we can take that question.
Yeah, I wish I had my notes in front of me, because there are specific ways in which the UNFCCC and the body is taking decisions about gender inclusivity and increasing gender representation. And I think that that's really, really important. And I think gender representation is like fundamentally important, but of course, representation doesn't translate to real change. And so I think we need kind of a thicker vision of, sorry, I'm talking about gender here because it's what I've been thinking a lot about. But a thicker vision of what, like a feminist imbued vision of what of climate law means. And so I think the gender representation and leadership is incredibly important, but I do think that we need to think a lot more about gender when we're starting to think again much more deeply about climate finance and adaptation measures. And again, I think that there are particular work programs under the Warsaw mechanism for loss and damage that are just being developed, where we still have this kind of moment of opportunity to think about gender inclusivity, as well as kind of other equity-based issues. Finally, I have a note of caution about, you know, as we start to develop the market-based mechanisms, the kind of Article 6 tools, however they emerge. You know, from a kind of capitalist economic perspective, there's, you know, potential for those to be used in really positive ways or to kind of embed existing challenges. And I know that's one area where the parties are still actively working. And so I think that that's another avenue where these things can be kind of really thought about in great detail.
Absolutely. That is one of the areas where COP26 and Glasgow still has to deliver from the negotiation perspective. Let me ask you one question, which is about climate justice, but also energy justice. And I'm just going to elaborate a little bit. Obviously, we have seen, for example, what has happened in Texas very recently.
My home state.
Like that. Although obviously the extreme, you know, it was definitely an extreme weather scenario. But, you know, I have friends in Texas, and lucky for them, they're definitely not in the most deprived areas of Texas. But even then, they just lived the unimaginable, let's say, in Texas for a few days. And where I'm going with this is that obviously Texas will be different from other parts of the world. And I'm thinking in particular, least developed countries where there is this conundrum between energy justice and climate justice. Or maybe there is not. This is my question to you to some extent. So you have a country that has discovered oil, coal, gas, and potentially could exploit it. And potentially, if done well, leave aside the environmental aspects, that could actually provide, electricity, electricity for pumps for clean water, and so forth and so forth. But then there's the climate dimension, clearly. So I do wonder how that discussion, even between the powerful voices that you said, are we only listening to the climate voices here and not in, say, a country like Zambia or Ivory Coast, or where there's an equally powerful person that says, look, I know climate change is a problem and clearly it's a global problem, but people need food now on their table. People need electricity now to be able to go to school and so forth and so forth. So how do we still deal with that huge challenge?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. Maybe I'll start with the kind of the US example you gave, and then think more broadly, kind of in the way that you framed the question. So the first is, so I'm actually from Texas, and all of my family is in Texas. And so I know that system well. And one of the things that I think that the challenges in Texas show is not a challenge with addressing climate change, but actually a fundamental problems with our existing energy infrastructure. Our energy infrastructure is heavy and outdated and very fossil fuel reliant. And even though in Texas, we've actually seen, Texas is actually one of the areas where we've seen the greatest growth in terms of wind capacity, and increasingly solar capacity, has the greatest wind capacity in the US, and is kind of catching up with California on solar. But the way in which they did that was through competition and deregulation, as opposed to California, which is actually kind of incentivize the move towards renewable energy through regulatory structures. And so what you've seen in Texas is the kind of the deregulation of the energy infrastructure that's kind of both allowed some growth in renewables, but has done so in ways that didn't guard against these kind of problems that we're seeing. So I mean, the grid in Texas is complex, and it's separated from the rest of the United States. And so there's a lot that we could talk about there, but I don't think that in any way the problems in what we see in Texas represent a challenge to efforts to decarbonize our grid. And so I just kind of want to be very clear about that. It doesn't mean that there's not complexity in integrating renewables into the grid, but it certainly doesn't suggest that that is going to lead to these kinds of challenges. Rather, what it suggests is that our entire grid is not prepared for the kinds of weather extremes that we're going to see with climate change. And so that's kind of a larger issue. But okay, so a little bit about energy justice, which I think is, really, really important. And I'm not going to pretend to be kind of a leading expert on this, and so I'm going to defer to some of my colleagues in this. But so first of all, I think it is, you have amazing people in Britain who've been thinking about this. Brenda Boardman, for example, who's been thinking about energy justice issues at Oxford for years and years and years. And thinking about ways to make sure that changes that we make to address climate change are not regressive, by thinking about ways to improve conservation and efficiency, and to limit the effects of changes in energy policy kind of down the road. So I think that there's a lot of people who are really giving a lot of thought to this. One of the things I want to say one thing briefly to kind of suggest hopefully we're going in the right direction, and think about the broader kind of the issues that you were focusing on, which is just really tension between environmental progress and human rights and fundamental, economic development, which of course is really the heart of international environmental law and always has been. So it's just kind of a perpetuation of that challenge. But so one thing I'll say is, in the United States, one of the things that we've seen with the Biden administration, which is really, really interesting, is for the first time that the actual terminology of energy justice is now reflected in administration, and Biden has appointed an amazing colleague of mine as the first, I can't remember what her official title is, but she's actually working on energy justice within the Department of Energy. And so just to say that, again, that's a really, really interesting and important shift, which is the idea that we have conceptions of energy justice that are now kind of institutionalized within our state structure, which is new. Okay, but backing out to the tensions between addressing environmental degradation, including climate change, and allowing for kind of economic growth in ways that ensure that we meet humans' basic needs. I think, again, those issues are longstanding, and I think what folks like Wangari Maathai have said all along is that across context, it's really not one or another. And what she kind of really showed with the Green Belt movement was the way to think about, integrating inequality considerations into our efforts to limit environmental degradation, but also open opportunities. Now, of course, that's very complex and looks different ways in different contexts, but I do think it's really fundamentally both true and important. And I think particularly in the gender context, that's played out, that if we just focus on economic development and recreating institutions we have in other parts of the world, that has not been successful in advancing economic development that really advances both human rights and limits inequality. And so I don't pretend to have any kind of easy solutions to that. It's a grand challenge. But I do think that the more we do and the more we learn, the more we have to think about these things hand in hand, or else we're just kind of perpetuating existing problems.
Thank you very much. And I think what is really promising is this change in terminology, because words do count in politics and in law. So that is, I feel, a very promising sign coming from the US, which we hope to see also at COP26 here in Glasgow, see the US back on board with the Paris Agreement and providing necessary leadership. I'm going to close here. I will be thanking, obviously, Cinnamon. I'm going to leave up the first slide for a minute or so. Feel free to use the chat to say a final hi to Cinnamon, to share again any information you want. But before I do that, not just from myself, but from the whole team at Skeld, thank you so much, Cinnamon, for an absolutely fascinating webinar. We learned so much, and we look forward, obviously, to continuing staying in touch. And it goes without saying, hopefully seeing you very soon in person and being able to, to do what we did before. But this was great. This is the silver lining. We can have you from far away and enjoy a nice conversation. So I'm going to put up the last slide. You are free to go if you want, but you are free also to just say a last hi via the chat to Cinnamon if you want. Thanks everybody for joining us. And it was really, really great to have you with us.
Thanks so much. Just as for anybody who's here, to say thank you for this opportunity. I think one of the things we're learning now more than ever is how listening is so important. So just hearing you frame your questions and hearing the thoughts that come up is as influential in my thinking as anything else. So thank you. I can't see my chat box. Oops. There we go. I don't know if people are still here, but I was just looking at this last question that's in the Q&A. I think that's really, really important. I mean, even in the United States, we've struggled with this in the context of agriculture and like the inability of people to kind of get in to see like animal welfare conditions. And I think it's a real fight all over the world. And I do think that this is where there's some power at the intersection, a lot of power at the intersection of climate change and human rights. I do also think that, in raising the visibility of some of these legal actions is really, really important to think about kind of mobilizing an international response. But yeah, it's a real worry.
So where's my voice? Okay, so thank you very much, Cinnamon. I think we are going to close officially now. So thanks for all of you joining us. And we look forward to seeing you on the 14th of May for the last Skeld webinar of the year. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.